Thank you, Beck, and thank you all for being here today. This is now over 34 years since Sartre died, and we are laboring in this rich body of works at a time that's radically different than even the year of his death. Just to recall a well-known story. Within a year after Sartre died, Reagan followed Thatcher into power, and together they ended the post-war consensus of labor and capital that had marked the 30 glorious years of prosperity following World War II. Responding to economic crisis after crisis, starting with the oil shock of 1973, Reagan and Thatcher presided over a conservative, now we call it neoliberal transformation, that sought to, among other things, reduce the power of labor and promoted deindustrialization and offshoring, as well as shrinking the welfare state, privatizing government services, and deregulation, especially of the financial sector. In terms of social values and commitments, this has meant we live today in a harsher and more difficult world, with a harsher and more difficult life for the majority, and a broad social acceptance of soaring inequality, with all the moral coarsening that this involves. These changes were accompanied by a transformation of once reformist and socialist parties into bastions of softer-hearted versions of neoliberalism, but now lacking any alternative vision of their own, even a reformist one. That's not all. In 1978, China began its conversion to capitalism. 11 years later, the Berlin Wall came down, initiating spectacular changes in Eastern Europe. Shortly afterward, the Soviet Union went out of existence. Communism, which had occupied so much of Sartre's thought, was largely over. And that's not all. The advent of neoliberalism and the passing of social democracy and communism were accompanied by a remarkable flourishing of new freedoms, due in large part to the movements of the 1960s and 1970s that Sartre had encouraged and embraced, resulting from struggles of students, racial and ethnic minorities, women and gays. These movements have had a transformative effect on the advanced societies, making them more diverse, more racially equal, more tolerant, more multicultural, and feminist in key ways, despite the other changes I've talked about, more livable for everyone. These social and political changes have become intertwined with a kaleidoscopic and immensely profitable expansion of choices and individual expressiveness, a proliferation of freedoms, amenities, and lifestyles, a word of times, unknown 50 years ago, including tattoos and pornography, the internet and smartphones, coffee houses and art fairs, t-shirts and jeans, oral sex and divorce, yoga and foreign travel, Twitter and Facebook, blogs and your comments on everything under the sun, and an explosion of middle-class passion for gourmet food and wines. Due to our own and others' efforts, and due to capitalism's uncanny capacity to profitably meet, and even more to invent and then meet new needs, the space in which so many of us move today is far freer, far more inclusive, more international, far more interesting and diverse, and humanly and socially far richer than people like ourselves would have imagined heading towards a demonstration 30 or 40 or 50 years ago. It's difficult to separate the freedoms from today's new technologies. Once amazing, but of course now become necessities of life. And all of these are firmly embedded in the consumer society, which has grown to levels never imagined by Sartre. Some keys to understanding the consumer explosion are presented by the great Sartrean André Gortz in his critique of economic reason. The first key is that advanced capitalism is no longer driven by meeting human needs. Since the beginning of the consumer economy, during the Golden Age, 1945 to 1975, people's vital needs have become less and less the driving economic force. And capitalism's own vital need to produce and market commodities has more and more become that force. Thus, in order to generate profit and growth, capitalism has become a vast, self-sustaining, need-creating machine. In other words, we've reached the point, according to Gortz, where consumption is now in the service of production, which is, of course, in the service of profit and growth. As he says, production no longer has, and I'm quoting him, the function of satisfying existing needs in the most efficient way possible. On the contrary, it is needs which increasingly have the function of enabling production to keep going. Unlimited growth, fueled by constant product development and advertising, means that the economy, which was once only a subsystem of social life with specific and necessary tasks to perform, in Gortz's pregnant formulation, quote, swallows up all areas of social activity. What's the result? Marx and Engels captured the system's dynamism in those several unforgettable paragraphs in the Communist Manifesto that famously climax with constant revolutionizing of production, uninterrupted disturbance of all social conditions, everlasting uncertainty and agitation distinguish the bourgeois epoch from all earlier ones. All fixed, fast, frozen relations with their train of ancient and venerable prejudices and opinions are swept away. All new-formed ones become antiquated before they can ossify. All that is solid melts into air. But Marx and Engels anticipated human intervention in a future when, quoting again, man is at last compelled to face with sober senses his real conditions of life and his relations with his kind. But what if man does no such thing? What if, especially under consumer capitalism, no oppositional force emerges to face the real conditions of people's lives? Or what if that force never mobilized sufficiently, or was defeated, or never became fully oppositional, or diminished? Or what if it eventually formed parties and movements with only minimal goals of controlling capitalism's worst effects and protecting its victims, knowing success for a brief time, again, that golden age, and then became defeated and demoralized, the meaning of Thatcher and Reagan? In short, what if Marx and Engels' description of the problem was correct? But both the reformist and the revolutionary solutions eventually misfired, and capitalism arrogantly went back on the offensive. Then, the maelstrom they described would become not a passing stage, but the world's permanent state, instead of being restrained and then mastered. And its dominant ideology would become neoliberalism. Since Sartre's death, the system's priorities have powerfully continued to transform our natural and built political, social, and psychological space through its drive for profits and growth. This drive increasingly subjects all corners of existence to a kind of free market totalitarianism where we meet commodification at every turn. We live within and are shaped by a maelstrom of progress driven by an uncontrolled force of expansion that sweeps everything in its path. All physical and human environments are caught up within its irresistible power. It increasingly seems as if no relationships, no spaces are exempt. Capitalism invades every nook and cranny of our social, natural, and psychological space. Everything is ripe for mapping, developing, marketing, from our most once hidden feelings to every square inch of what was once the wilderness. To Google Map geographic space can yield thrilling results, but it turns everything into a potential source of profit, places every space under surveillance. In sum, since Sartre's death, we have seen the definitive triumph of capitalism, the end of the golden age, when many in the working class were able to achieve a middle-class standard of living, new freedoms and equalities, new riches in every direction, new and obscene inequalities, amazing information and communications technologies, the economic system and the market coming to thoroughly dominate all else, yet, deliberately placed out of control to the point of threatening the ecosystem, all in the absence of countervailing social movements except for the evanescent Occupy. Corresponding to these features of the post-Sartrean world is the most curious fact of all for us today, here. For even the most casual reader of Sartre, since Margaret Thatcher, a crude and primitive version of Sartrean themes of individual responsibility, freedom, and self-determination has taken over the ideological and cultural stage, especially in the US and UK. For example, how bizarre that for 3 years after the beginning of the global financial crisis and the Great Recession, the strongest protest movement in the United States was the Tea Party, ranting about freedom, worshiping the individual, and markets demanding more of the same neoliberal policies that caused the collapse in the first place. Indeed, go on the internet. Among the Tea Party bloggers is someone who writes about inherent autonomy and signs his articles with the name Sartre. Sartre and the Tea Party? We shouldn't be too surprised, because some of us recall discussions we had as students or teaching students about the arguments from existentialism as a humanism. Because Sartre made major contributions to the contemporary understanding and arguments for the individual's freedom, responsibility, and self-determination. And he amplified these with attention-getting statements such as, "The slave in chains is free to break them." However, my point is that Sartre's career is relevant to us, still relevant, maybe more relevant than ever, not as a source of today's ideology of near absolute individual freedom and responsibility, but as its refutation. In fact, if the central attitudinal and ideological features of the neoliberal universe are to ignore oppression and inequality, to encourage individuals to see themselves as isolated from each other, responsible only for their own fate, and incapable of acting collectively, Sartre is one of the last century's main thinkers to turn to for guidance in resisting this outlook. He gives us important tools for organizing to confront the current capitalist maelstrom. I have in mind 3 things. First, his fierce hatred of oppression of all sorts. 2, the fact that this philosopher of individual freedom goes on to explore our social rootedness including many of the multiple ways in which we are conditioned by forces beyond our control. And 3, most important, he gives us ways to understand how isolated individuals can form into groups. First of all, perhaps more impulse than tool, he gives us a starting point for all social and political analysis and activity with his fierce hatred of oppression. Predating his idea of freedom itself, and ever deepening to the end of his life, this hostility led him to make mistakes, but also propelled him to become one of the century's great moralists. Very different then, but certainly the equal of his one-time friend, Albert Camus. If choice, action, and freedom were central to Sartre, how is it he began to think about individuals, movements, and social systems that would seek to reduce or eliminate this capacity? He developed a visceral fury. I shouldn't say developed, it was there from the start, towards demeaning attitudes and behaviors, towards social systems and practices such as torture that try to reduce another person to the status of a thing, towards systems that enshrine some people as having rights over others. Even his most apolitical of books, Nausea, conveys that fury, both towards the bourgeoisie of Bouvines and the Corsican guard at the library. That impulse never disappeared. Secondly, is Sartre's very focus on the individual. Because over a lifetime, he developed an understanding of the individual that enables us, forces us to combat current so-called libertarian dogma. After all, where is the free and self-determining individual located? In Being and Nothingness, he said, and I quote, "There is freedom only in a situation, and there is a situation only through freedom. One's situation, indeed one's very self, includes one's class, race, gender, family, all located in a specific history, and as Sartre says later, all the various determinations that one internalizes and then re-exteriorizes as one's project." That's why, beginning in 1947, the philosopher of freedom published his essay under the title of Situations. Indeed, the most significant among these 10 volumes of Situations and several independent works of essays explore how people shape themselves in oppressive situations, sometimes to the point of resistance. Anti-Semite and Jew, Black Orpheus, Colonialism as a System, his essay on torture, his preface to Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth, Stalin's Ghost, Communists and Peace. Most of these essays appear in the New York Review collection of his essays, edited by myself and Adrian Vandenhoven. And this piece of his work includes trying to understand how individuals shape themselves within their family with all of its specific historical, social, and gender determinations, as, for example, in his biography of Gustave Flaubert. One of my favorite and the least noticed among these writings is his brief preface to the psychiatrist Lang and Cooper's Reason and Violence, where he describes neurosis strikingly as, and I'm quoting him, the path chosen by the organism to live an unlivable situation. Taken together, this whole life work of explorations of individual self-determination within historical, social, and family situations constitute one of the great intellectual adventures of the 20th century. In this adventure, the philosopher of individual responsibility takes Marxism on board, understands racial oppression and colonialism, takes Freud on board, never giving up his individual starting point and sense of individual self-creation. Never falling victim to any sort of mechanistic determinism. This Sartre is essential for combating the right-wing myth, the lie really, of unlimited economic and social freedom. And as my friend Betty Cannon pointed out a few years ago in a wonderful work entitled Sartre and Psychoanalysis, this Sartre is also essential for the theory and practice of psychotherapy. He stresses the reality of choice and responsibility within situations over which we have no control, recognizing the force of situations that limit choice but never eliminate it, not only directing and shaping choice, but shaping the tools with which we choose. Sartre thus helps us to answer the so-called libertarians, their decontextualized and primitive ideas of freedom with deeper and richer understandings that point us to the individual's social situations. Third, Sartre helps us towards another complex insight we vitally need today. That the separate individuals produced in the conditions in which we more and more live can indeed overcome our isolation and form groups capable of collective action. This will be the heart of my discussion, my Sartrean phenomenology of social hope. In Critique of Dialectical Reason, Sartre talks about being an us object, which he calls seriality, and I call the phenomenon of usness. Socially imposed arrangements in which each of us acts alongside others, but in isolation from them. Waiting for a bus in an orderly queue is one example. Listening to the top 40 is another. Engaging in market transactions and relationships, he doesn't mention these, would be another. The state of usness of a passive and externally determined collectivity with each individual furiously working as an individual is our customary social experience, whose outer limits we reach in highly charged but still serial and separated moments of national tragedy, sporting events, and elections. Many of us were glued on one of these yesterday for several weeks, and last night and early this morning. Sartre would call this a serial moment of social participation. We were all there in the fall of 2008. Separate and isolated individuals united because we were holding our breath and fearfully watching what would happen. In the thought experiment that is the Critique of Dialectical Reason, Sartre points out that this state of separation and usually passivity, which he argues is normally characteristic even of the proletariat, may break down under conditions of threat or need. If the bus doesn't show up, we may disperse. But we may also form ourselves into a group, trying to do something about the situation. The fusing group, a much better expression than fused group, which is how it's translated, the fusing group begins there. Or it begins with a few workers grumbling about their working conditions, when one of them suggests that maybe they should do something about it, and someone offers their apartment or house to hold a meeting to talk further. Or it begins when someone contacts a group of friends and neighbors about organizing a community meeting to discuss the impending war, and then they set a date and reserve a room at the local library for that meeting. Or on July 13th, 2011, when Adbusters magazine issued the following call: On September 17th, we want to see 20,000 people flood into lower Manhattan, set up tents, kitchens, peaceful barricades, and occupy Wall Street for a few months. End of quote. This was followed, of course, by weeks of intense planning by activists, and then the date came. Lo and behold, thousands of people took over Zuccotti Park in lower Manhattan, and then the movement spread to millions of others, including here, acting similarly. For over 2 centuries, the constantly assembling, fragmenting, and regathering we of the left, or we's of the left, have done similarly, generating, contributing to, and inspired by the hope to create a better world, usually in highly specific ways. In the process of participating or identifying with such a movement, if we do identify with it, we change. We change by becoming part of a we. We change both in our being and in our perception. This is both an ontological and an epistemological transformation in our being and our perception. Separated and isolated to start, we make ourselves members of a larger entity, drawing power from that, having responsibility towards it, having tasks in relation to it, experiencing ourselves within it. We carry out tasks for the group, and this active collective stance generates a sense that didn't exist as among serial individuals, a sense that it is possible to alter social reality. This recasts situations and relationships that had once seemed fixed and blocked. The very existence of such a we overcomes the passivity and isolation in which its members found themselves before they came together and brought the we into being. By contesting existing social structures and practices, the we demands that things be more fair, more humane, or more equal, more democratic. It demands peace, trade unions, water, shelter, a safe environment. We thus challenge the dominant system of power and its practices, those who benefit from the system, those who control it. In so doing, we sense the possibility of things being different, and we experience our own power to make it so. Self-empowered, we willingly contest those who have power over us. Solidarity, each for each other, all for each, and each for all, replaces individual self-seeking as our social norm. And we draw upon and contribute to a new current of aspirations and morality. This can eventually become wider than our own we, can be seen, if we do the studying, to stretch back in time and even shape our present, as well as forecasting a better future for everyone. In creating ourselves as a movement, then, we create a kind of hope that hadn't existed before. Social hope. This is a remarkable change in our being, accompanied by a no less remarkable change in our perception. By becoming collective actors, opposing ourselves to dominant actors, we are keen to find their weaknesses and resistances, as well as our own strengths and the objective possibilities of winning. The once fixed and frozen field dominating us becomes redefined as our practical one, and once we become its active agents, our adversaries lose their apparent autonomy, their quality of givenness. We analyze them in terms of their purposes, their strengths, and their vulnerabilities. The complex historical and social field is no longer simply an immovable fact of life, but now becomes a series of guides, helps, and obstacles. Once viewed individually and passively, formerly overwhelming forces now become antagonists to be overcome or circumvented. Once fixed situations become experienced as fluid and subject to change. This may be a psychological change, but not only. This change in how we see is also a change in what we see. We recognize social arrangements, the way things are, as humanly created, and look for the ways to change these. My own horizon now extends well beyond myself, and the we becomes the locus of perception and engine of action, an energetic force engaged in changing things. To a skeptic with no memory of such an experience, or one who is unable to imagine it, it may sound implausible that the impotence of scattered individuals can give way to an empowered sense of we. It may seem far-fetched that the formerly powerless can generate something new, social hope, by acting together. In the Critique, Sartre talks about the storming of the Bastille in July 1789. There have been many other dramatic moments when everything seems to come together, creating a collective will, its power, and the sense of possibility it generates. One such moment was the early morning of December 5th, 1955 in Montgomery, Alabama, when the buses rolled from black neighborhoods to the rest of the city completely empty. The boycott was succeeding. No one rode the bus. Or less well known, the pageant in which Patterson silk workers themselves enacted the story of their strike in drama and music before an overflow crowd in Madison Square Garden on the evening of June 7, 1913. And yes, many of us can recall the images in 1994, still posted on YouTube today, of newly empowered citizens in long lines waiting to vote in the first free South African elections. Inspired by the enormously successful, but still to be completed, worldwide campaign for nuclear disarmament, as well as by Sartre, I wrote some of the following many years ago, which forms the core of my current project of social hope. The kind of reality I'm talking about was produced on the 12th of June, 1982, by nearly 1 million people who streamed into New York from all over the United States to demand an end to the threat of nuclear war. By coming together, they created a new kind of perception. Their assemblage made possible the collective sharing of a collective problem. We are being threatened. Normally, the isolated individual can't experience this, but thinks in terms of I or my family are being threatened. Collective perception, the possibility of collective experience, reveals our world as ours in a way usually inaccessible to separate atoms, no matter how politicized those separate atoms are. Those who filled Central Park that day, awed by their sheer numbers, were able to give voice and hearing to those layers of their experience and reality which normally remain closed, lacking appropriate categories of thought and feeling. Such electrifying moments capture, in especially striking ways, the spirit and meaning of a movement. They all contain self-organization, solidarity, and the ingenuity of ordinary people. However sporadically and even momentarily, people live differently, become different. The career of Occupy Wall Street and its offshoots shows dramatically another striking feature of social hope generated by such a movement. It can become contagious as movements encourage other movements. This happened in 1848, 1917, 1936, and as Sartre himself pointed out in the neglected but essential interview with Rossana Rossanda in 1968 in Paris. Who would have thought, Sartre said, that 14 million peasants would be able to resist the greatest industrial and military power in the world? And they inspired the students of Paris, students in the United States, and eventually workers in all of France. And that example was also spreading to the UK and to socialism with the human face in Czechoslovakia. The movement that began at the Sorbonne in Paris inspired a strike of 10 million workers that paralyzed all of France. Something similar but different happened again in 1989 and 2011, when increasingly people halfway around the earth strongly saw themselves being affected by others would do something similar, and in the process overcome their own seriality and isolation and passivity, and themselves generated a sense of we, crystallizing that will to act. The General Motors strike in Flint, Michigan in 1936 and 1937 spurred a wave of sit-down strikes throughout American industry, involving, in the words of its historian, every conceivable type of worker: kitchen and laundry workers in the Israel Zion Hospital in Brooklyn, pencil makers, janitors, dog catchers, newspaper pressmen, sailors, tobacco workers, Woolworth girls, rug weavers, hotel and restaurant employees, pie bakers, watchmakers, garbage collectors, Western Union messengers, opticians, and lumbermen, all inspired by the GM sit-down strike. Now, it is clear from our own experience, most recently Occupy, that the we of a movement is not necessarily the spontaneous coming together described by Sartre of individuals who find themselves Place de la Bastille at a given moment, or with the same needs or the same consciousness of what must be done. It may, in many ways, be the more or less deliberate product of a team actively planning for months or years, as with the Greenham Common and the anti-nuclear demonstrations of the 1980s in 2010 and 2011 in Tahrir Square, or the coming together of those labor groups, labor activists who planned the Flint sit-down strike in General Motors. Sartre understood this in his discussions of the Communist Party, in his essay on the Communists in Peace. He understood that each movement is embedded in a patient struggle belonging to a longer story. The Montgomery bus boycott went on for 13 months in 1955 and 6. And in any case, its victory only presaged the struggles to come years later. Patterson silk strikers managed to hold out for 5 months before the strike collapsed. The anti-nuclear campaign spread and expanded for 40 years before reaching its peak. And it's still only partial victory. And the great South African moment, remember, people queuing to vote, is rooted in a history that dates back at least to the beginning of the African National Congress in 1912, its defiance campaign in 1952, and its armed struggle beginning in 1951. Unity becomes a key theme of such movements because this is never a given and often has to be forged over time, as well as experienced at seemingly apocalyptic moments. And because the tendency to fragment is so strong, especially with struggles that go on for years, with many leaderships competing, sometimes violently, against each other. Movements are constantly recomposing, disintegrating, and moving into action time and again. Making tactical and strategic mistakes, and yet, in the case of South Africa, for example, never losing some degree of coherence, energy, and will. Now, I wish I could stop Sartre's analysis right here. I wish I could stop his writing of this story. Because so far, it's a very inspiring story. You see, I picked up on it, and I've used it to generate and work through my own sense of social hope. Sartre clearly makes the point about overcoming impotence and isolation by participating in effective collectivities. And these have changed our world profoundly. And what I'd like to do is just gather up all those changes and talk about how different the world is because of all those movements. But Sartre and history will not allow us a happy ending. To his credit, Sartre insists on letting the 20th century have its way. And this is the second half of the first volume of the critique, and throughout critique too. Sartre points out that shortly after forming themselves, the members of a group discover the need to pledge themselves to it in order to sustain it beyond that moment. An act of consolidation, which happens freely and spontaneously. But the collective decision begins to impose a weight on its members. They pledge themselves to the group. They assume responsibilities for maintaining the collectivity, and they begin to develop sanctions for failing to do so. So begins the practice and process of the group's institutionalization. Members of the group, leaders of the group, begin to work on the group itself, creating a stable leadership, which has to be created if it didn't exist before. And these members of the leadership will appoint lieutenants to assert the group's imperative on the rest of the group and on everyone touched by it. For Sartre, this is the process through which a revolutionary group passes, for the sake of its survival, becoming an ever more rigid institution. In the Soviet Union, under conditions of civil war, encirclement, and profound scarcity, eventually becoming a dictatorship. The Stalin was, for Sartre, not an accident, but the result of the Bolshevik Revolution. Accordingly, as he analyzed it, in a searching interview with Rosanna Rosanda, this locus of hope, is always a work in progress, and keeping it unified is as essential as trying to restore and perpetuate its sense of spontaneity. Struggling against a well-organized system, some form of counter-organization, perhaps even a party, is needed. And as Sartre said in that interview, the problem is to know how to prevent that counter-organization from deteriorating by becoming an institution. The United Automobile Workers, after the Flint-Sit-Down strike, became an institution, to the extent that within not very long time, many of the most militant workers found themselves struggling against the union. And this is a pattern that happens throughout history. Institutions become corrupt, become centralized, become bureaucratic. The situation has evolved in this direction in South Africa. Sartre says this is a problem to be solved at the end of the interview, and presumably requiring more thought, more discussion, and more research. I think I'd like to leave it there for now. The generation of social hope, yes, real, possible, repeated time and again, something many of us, perhaps all of us, have participated in. And yet the pitfalls and problems of group struggles and groups becoming institutionalized. Groups will continue to form, we know that. Especially insofar as we serialized individuals find ourselves threatened by the social system that keeps us separated. That is our answer, Sartre's answer, to the neoliberal individualism. We will continue to find ourselves reaching out and searching for others in the name of creating collective action. And for now, perhaps that should be the main point, and the rest can be for discussion. Even under conditions of neoliberalism, individuals taught to see ourselves as being completely on our own can and will become movements, can become a force to change history, have done so, and will continue to do so. Thank you.